Hello, wildlings. I'm your Creep Smith, and you found my Fear Forge. Lucky you. Welcome back, wildlings. Tonight, we continue with our deep delve into the dark heart of the city with Part 2 of Midnight Meat Train by Clive Barker. Kaufman was not finished by 11, an hour after he'd promised himself release, but exasperation and ennui were making the job more difficult, and the sheets of figures were beginning to blur in front of him. At 11:10, he threw down his pen and admitted defeat. He rubbed his hot eyes with the cushions of his palms till his head was filled with colors. Fuck it, he said. He never swore in company, but once in a while to say fuck it to himself was a great consolation. He made his way out of the office, damp coat over his arm, and headed for the elevator. His limbs felt drugged, and his eyes would scarcely stay open. It was colder outside than he'd anticipated, and the air brought him out of his lethargy a little. He walked toward the subway at 34th Street. Catch an express to Far Rockaway, home in an hour. Neither Kaufman nor Mahogany knew it, but at 96th and Broadway the police had arrested what they took to be the subway killer, having trapped him in one of the uptown trains. A small man of European extraction, wielding a hammer and a saw, had cornered a young woman in the second car and threatened to cut her in half in the name of Jehovah. Whether he was capable of fulfilling this threat was doubtful. As it was, he didn't get the chance. While the rest of the passengers, including 2 Marines, looked on, the intended victim landed a kick to the man's testicles. He dropped the hammer, she picked it up, and broke his lower jaw and right cheekbone with it before the Marines stepped in. When the train halted at 96th, the police were waiting to arrest the subway butcher. They rushed the car and the horde, yelling like banshees and scared as shit. The butcher was lying in one corner of the car, his face in pieces. They carted him away, triumphant. The woman, after questioning, went home with the Marines. It was to be a useful diversion, though Mahogany couldn't know it at the time. It took the police the best part of the night to determine the identity of their prisoner, chiefly because he couldn't do more than drool through his shattered jaw. It wasn't until 3:30 in the morning when one Captain Davis, coming on duty, recognized the man as a retired flower salesman from the Bronx called Hank Vassarelli. Hank, it seemed, was regularly arrested for threatening behavior and indecent exposure, all in the name of Jehovah. Appearances deceived. He was about as dangerous as the Easter Bunny. This was not the subway slaughterer. By the time the cops had worked that out, Mahogany had been about his business a long while. It was 11:15 when Kaufman got on the express through to Mott Avenue. He shared the car with 2 other travelers. One was a middle-aged black woman in a purple coat, the other a pale, acne-ridden adolescent who was staring at the "Kiss My White Ass" graffiti on the ceiling with spaced-out eyes. Kaufman was in the first car. He had a journey of 35 minutes duration ahead of him. He let his eyes slide closed, reassured by the rhythmical rocking of the train. It was a tedious journey, and he was tired. He didn't see Mahogany's face either, staring through the door between the cars, looking for some more meat. At 14th Street, the black woman got out. Nobody got in. Kaufman opened his eyes briefly, taking in the empty platform at 14th, then shut them again. The doors hissed closed. He was drifting in that warm somewhere between awareness and sleep, and there was a fluttering of nascent dreams in his head. It was a good feeling. The train was off again, rattling down into the tunnels. Maybe, at the back of his dozing mind, Kaufman half-registered that the doors between the second and first cars had been slid open. Maybe he smelt the sudden gush of tunnel air and registered that the noise of the wheels was momentarily louder, but he chose to ignore it. Maybe he even heard the scuffle as Mahogany subdued the youth with the spaced-out stare, but the sound was too distant and the promise of sleep was too tempting. He drowsed on. For some reason, his dreams were of his mother's kitchen. She was chopping turnips and smiling sweetly as she chopped. He was only small in his dream and was looking up at her radiant face while she worked. Chop, chop, chop. His eyes jerked open. His mother vanished. The car was empty, and the youth was gone. How long had he been dozing? He hadn't remembered the train stopping at West 4th Street. He looked up, his head full of slumber, and almost fell over as the train rocked violently. It seemed to have gathered quite a substantial head of speed. Maybe the driver was keen to be home, wrapped up in bed with his wife. They were going at a fair lick. In fact, it was bloody terrifying. There was a blind drawn down over the window between the cars which hadn't been down before as he remembered. A little concern crept into Kaufman's sober head. Suppose he'd been sleeping a long while and the guard had overlooked him in the car. Perhaps they'd passed Far Rockaway and the train was now speeding on its way to wherever they took trains for the night. "Fuck it," he said aloud. Should he go forward and ask the driver? It was such a bloody idiot question to ask. Where am I? At this time of night, was he likely to get more than a stream of abuse by the way of reply? Then the train began to slow. A station. Yes, this was a station. The train emerged from the tunnel and into the dirty light of the station at West 4th Street. No, he'd missed no stops. So where had the boy gone? Either he'd ignored the warning on the car wall forbidding transfer between the cars while in transit, or else he'd gone into the driver's cabin up front. Probably between the driver's legs even now, Kaufman thought, his lip curling. It wasn't unheard of. This was the Palace of Delights, after all, and everyone had their right to a little love in the dark. Kaufman shrugged to himself. What did he care where the boy had gone? The doors closed. Nobody had boarded the train. It shunted off from the station, the lights flickering as it used a surge of power to pick up some speed again. Kaufman felt the desire for sleep come over him afresh, but the sudden fear of being lost had pumped adrenaline into his system, and his limbs were tingling with nervous energy. His senses had sharpened, too. Then, even over the clatter and rumble of the wheels on the tracks, he heard the sound of tearing cloth coming from the next car. Was someone tearing their shirt off? He stood up, grasping one of the straps for balance. The window between the cars was completely curtained off, but he stared at it, frowning as though he might suddenly discover X-ray vision. The car rocked and rolled. It was really traveling again. Another ripping sound. Wait, was it rape? With no more than a mild voyeuristic urge, he moved down the seesawing car towards the intersecting door, hoping there might be a chink in the curtain. His eyes were still fixed on the window, and he failed to notice the splatters of blood he was treading in until his heel slipped. He looked down. His stomach almost saw the blood before his brain, and the ham on whole wheat was halfway up his gullet, catching in the back of his throat. Blood. He took several large gulps of stale air and looked away, back at the window. His head was saying blood. Nothing would make the word go away. There was no more than a yard or two between him and the door now. He had to look. There was blood on his shoe and a thin trail to the next car, but he still had to look. He had to. He took 2 more steps to the door and scanned the curtain, looking for a flaw in the blind. A pulled thread in the weave, that would be sufficient. There was a tiny hole. He glued his eye to it. His mind refused to accept what his eyes were seeing beyond the door. It rejected the spectacle as preposterous, as a dream sight. His reason said that it couldn't be real, but his flesh knew it was. His body became rigid with terror. His eyes, unblinking, could not close off the appalling scene through the curtain. He stayed at the door while the train rattled on, while his blood was drained from his extremities and his brain reeled from the lack of oxygen. Bright spots flashed in front of his vision, blotting out the atrocity, and he fainted. He was unconscious when the train reached J Street. He was deaf to the driver's announcement that all travelers beyond the station would have to change trains. Had he heard this, he would have questioned the sense of it. No trains disgorged all their passengers at J Street. The line ran to Mott Avenue via the Aqueduct racetrack past the JFK airport. He would have asked what kind of train this could be, except that he already knew. The truth was hanging in the next car. It was smiling contentedly to itself from behind a bloody chainmail apron. This was the midnight meat train. There was no accounting for time in a dead faint. It could have been seconds or hours that passed before Kaufman's eyes flickered open again and his mind focused on his newfound situation. He lay under one of the seats now, sprawled along the vibrating wall of the car, hidden from view. Fate was with him so far, he thought. Somehow, the rocking of the car must have jockeyed his unconscious body out of sight. He thought of the horror in Car 2 and swallowed back vomit. He was alone. Wherever the guard was, murdered perhaps, there was no way he could call for help. And the driver? Was he dead at the controls? Was the train even now hurtling through an unknown tunnel, a tunnel without a single station to identify it towards its destruction? And if there was no crash to be killed in, there was always the butcher, still hacking away a door's thickness from where Kaufman lay. Whichever way he turned, the name on the door was Death. The noise was deafening, especially lying on the floor. Kaufman's teeth were shaking in their sockets, and his face felt numb with the vibration. Even his skull was aching. Gradually, he felt strength seeping back into his exhausted limbs. He cautiously stretched his fingers and clenched his fists to set the blood flowing there again. And as the feeling returned, so did the nausea. He kept seeing the grisly brutality in the next car. He'd seen photographs of murder victims before, of course, but these were no common murders. He was in the same train as the subway butcher, the monster who strung his victims up by the feet through the straps, hairless and naked. How long before the serial killer stepped through that door and claimed him? He was sure that if the slaughterer didn't finish him, expectation would. Then he heard movement beyond the door. Instinct took over. Kaufman thrust himself further under the seat and tucked himself up into a tiny ball with his sick white face to the wall. Then he covered his head with his hands and closed his eyes as tightly as any child in terror of the boogeyman. The door slid open. Click, whoosh. A rush of air up from the rails. It smelt stranger than any Kaufman had smelt before, and colder. This was somehow primal air in his nostrils, hostile and unfathomable air. It made him shudder. Then the door closed. Click. The butcher was close. Kaufman knew it. He could be standing no more than a matter of inches from where Kaufman lay. Was he even now looking down at his back? Even now bending, knife in hand, to scoop Kaufman out of his hiding place like a snail hooked from its shell? But nothing happened. He felt no breath on his neck. His spine was not slit open. There was simply a clatter of feet close to Kaufman's head, and then the same sound receding. Kaufman's breath, held in his lungs till they hurt, was expelled in a rasp between his teeth. Mahogany was almost disappointed that the sleeping man had alighted at West 4th Street. He was hoping for one more job to do that night, to keep him occupied while they descended. But no, the man had gone. The potential victim hadn't looked that healthy anyway, he thought to himself. He was an anemic Jewish accountant, probably. The meat wouldn't have been of any real quality. Mahogany walked the length of the car to the driver's cabin. He'd spend the rest of the journey there. My Christ, thought Kaufman. He's gonna kill the driver. He heard the cabin door open, then the voice of the butcher low and hoarse. Hi. Hi. They knew each other. All done? All done. Kaufman was shocked by the banality of the exchange. All done? What did that mean, all done? He missed the next few words as the train hit a particularly noisy section of track. Kaufman could resist looking no longer. Warily, he uncurled himself and glanced over his shoulder down the length of the car. All he could see was the butcher's legs and the bottom of the open cabin door. Damn. He wanted to see the monster's face again. There was laughter now. Kaufman calculated the risks of the situation, the mathematics of panic. If he remained where he was, sooner or later the butcher would glance down at him and he'd be mincemeat. On the other hand, if he were to move from his hiding place, he would risk being seen and pursued. Which was worse, stasis and meeting his death trapped in a hole, or making a break for it and confronting his maker in the middle of the car. Kaufman surprised himself with his mettle. He would move. Infinitesimally slowly, he crawled out from under the seat, watching the butcher's back every minute as he did so. Once out, he began to crawl towards the door. Each step he took was a torment, but the butcher seemed far too engrossed by his conversation to turn around. Kaufman had finally reached the door. He began to stand up, trying all the while to prepare himself for the sight that he would meet in car 2. The handle was grasped, and he slid the door open. The noise of the rails increased, and a wave of dank air, stinking of nothing on earth, came up to him. Surely the butcher must hear this, or at least smell it. Surely he must turn, but no. Kaufman skinned his way through the slit he had opened, and so through into the bloody chamber beyond. Relief made him careless. He failed to latch the door properly behind him, and it began to slide open with the buffeting of the train. Mahogany put his head out of the cabin and stared down the car toward the door. "What the fuck's that?" said the driver. Didn't close the door properly, that's all." Kaufman heard the butcher walking toward the door. He crouched, a ball of consternation, against the intersecting wall, suddenly aware of how full his bowels were. The door was pulled closed from the other side, and the footsteps receded again. Safe. For another breath, at least. Kaufman opened his eyes, steeling himself for the slaughter pen in front of him. There was no avoiding it. It filled every one of his senses, the smell of open entrails, the sight of the bodies, the feel of the fluid on the floor under his fingers, the sound of the straps creaking beneath the weight of the corpses, even the air tasting salty with blood. He was with death, absolutely, in that cubbyhole hurtling through the dark. But there was no nausea now. There was no feeling left but a casual revulsion. He even found himself peering at the bodies with some curiosity. The carcass closest to him was the remains of the pimply youth that he'd seen in car 1. The body hung upside down, swinging back and forth to the rhythm of the train, in unison with its 3 fellows, an obscene dance macabre. Its arms dangled loosely from its shoulder joints, into which gashes an inch or 2 deep had been made so the bodies would hang more neatly. Each part of the dead kid's anatomy was swaying hypnotically, the tongue hanging from its open mouth, the head lolling on its slit neck. Even the youth's penis flapped from side to side on his plucked groin. The head wound and the open jugular still pulsed blood into a black bucket. There was an elegance about the whole sight, the sign of a job well done. Beyond that body were strung up corpses of 2 young white women and a darker-skinned male. Kaufman turned his head on one side to look at their faces. They were quite blank. One of the girls was a beauty. He decided that the male had been Puerto Rican. All of them were shorn of their head and body hair. In fact, the air was still pungent with the smell of the shearing. Kaufman slid up the wall out of the crouching position, and as he did so, one of the women's bodies turned around, presenting a dorsal view. He was not prepared for this last horror. The meat of her back had been entirely cleft open from neck to buttock, and the muscle had been peeled back to expose the glistening vertebra. It was the final triumph of the butcher's craft. Here they hung, these shaved, bled, slit slabs of humanity, opened up like fish and ripe for devouring. Kaufman almost smiled at the perfection of its horror. He felt an offer of insanity tickling at the base of his skull, tempting him into oblivion, promising a blank indifference to the world. He began to shake uncontrollably. He felt his vocal cords trying to form a scream. This was intolerable, and yet to scream was to become, in a short while, like the creatures in front of him. "Fuck it," he said more loudly than he'd intended, then, pushing himself off from the wall, began to walk down the car between the swaying corpses, observing the neat piles of clothes and belongings that sat in the seats behind their owners. Under his feet the floor was sticky with drying bile. Even with his eyes closed to cracks, he could see the blood in the buckets too clearly. It was thick and heady and had flecks of grit turning in it. He was past the youth now, and he could see the door into car 3 ahead. All he had to do was run this gauntlet of atrocities. He urged himself on, trying to ignore the horrors and to concentrate on the door that would lead him back into sanity. He was past the first woman. A few more yards, he said to himself. 10 steps at most, less if he walked out with confidence. Then the lights went out. So, if you want to see what finally happens to our young protagonist, tune in next time when we finish up with Clive Barker's Midnight Meat Train. Until then, stay scary, wildlings, and make the most of your nights.